Welcome to this explainer. Today we're tackling a massive historical misconception. You know that idea that women's rights have always progressed in this strict linear line, from ancient oppression straight to modern freedom? Well, we tend to think of history as this slow, steady march toward equality. But as we're about to see through some incredible archaeological and textual evidence, the reality of human civilization is way more complex. And frankly, it's a lot more fascinating. Let's get right into it.
We almost always assume women in ancient times had zero autonomy, right? That they just existed under the thumbs of men until very recently. But the evidence actually reveals a paradigm shift that might completely change how you view history. In this explainer, we're going to evaluate how women in ancient pre-Islamic civilizations, specifically Persia, Egypt, and Sumer, along with those in early Judeo-Christian frameworks, actually possessed greater systemic legal, economic, and marital autonomy when compared to the later frameworks established by classical Islamic jurisprudence.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the myth of linear progress. Second, economic power in antiquity. Third, queens and spiritual egalitarianism. Fourth, classical Islamic jurisprudence. And finally, we'll compare these systemic legal rights side by side.
All right, let's start with Section 1, the myth of linear progress, unearthing bureaucratic proof of ancient female autonomy.
Take a look at this. It's one of the Persepolis fortification tablets discovered back in the 1930s. These date back to around 500 BCE during the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius the Great, and there are thousands of them, all written in Elamite cuneiform. What's amazing here is that they provide indisputable, day-to-day bureaucratic evidence of women owning land, managing massive businesses, entering into legal contracts, and even traveling freely across the empire. All of this completely independent of male guardians. It's just incredible hard proof.
Moving on to Section 2, Economic Power in Antiquity. We'll look at equal pay and legal competency in Persia and Egypt.
So the economic logs from those Persian tablets, they actually prove that wages were distributed strictly based on skill and position, not gender. High-ranking female supervisors, known as the Arasharara, oversaw massive workforces of both men and women, and they often earned the exact same or sometimes significantly more than their male counterparts. On top of that, get this, the state provided formal maternity benefits. Pregnant workers and new mothers received extra rations of grain, beer, wine, and meat to support themselves and their babies.
If we jump geographically over to ancient Egypt, we see this amazing contrast in legal standing. Under Egyptian law, women were considered legally kapaks. That basically means they were fully competent to administer, buy, sell, and bequeath property entirely on their own. No male supervision needed whatsoever. This is a really stark contrast to Greco-Roman societies where women were subjected to a kurios, which was a mandatory male guardian who had to validate any legal acts. But in Egypt, women could even serve as executors of wills and bring actions in court in their own names.
The crucial point here is that this level of legal independence extended straight into marriage. Egyptian women utilized heavily protective prenuptial agreements. If a husband initiated a divorce, he was heavily penalized. He lost his right to marital gifts and was legally forced to pay alimony until his ex-wife remarried or until she specifically asked him to stop. Furthermore, in the event of a divorce, the home and the children remained with the mother. And there was absolutely no social stigma for a woman choosing to leave a husband who just didn't suit her anymore.
Now for Section 3, Queens and Spiritual Egalitarianism, focusing on female sovereignty and the Judeo-Christian framework.
Women in antiquity didn't just manage money or households, they literally ruled empires. In the Sasanian Empire, which came after the Achaemenids, archaeologists have actually recovered silver drachm coins stamped with the portrait of Empress Bahram. She held the title Queen of Queens, ruling the empire entirely in her own right. And if we go even further back to early Sumeria, the Sumerian king list records Queen Kubaba. She was a former tavern keeper who ascended to rule the city-state of Kish as an absolute monarch, completely without a male consort.
Transitioning over into the early Judeo-Christian framework, we see this massive shift in theological worth. While the Greco-Roman world was heavily stratified, the Apostle Paul introduced what was really a radical spiritual egalitarianism. This famous verse from Galatians basically declares an erasing of spiritual hierarchies. It affirmed that both genders share the exact same spiritual worth and the exact same access to salvation. This directly reflects the Genesis concept that both men and women share the imago Dei, meaning the image of God.
This early Christian theology also totally revolutionized marriage. For one, it strictly prohibited unilateral male divorce, which was a huge deal, because in the ancient world, that practice frequently left abandoned wives completely destitute.
Plus, as this quote from 1 Corinthians highlights, it established an unprecedented mandate of mutual bodily authority. The idea of headship was redefined. Husbands were commanded to love their wives as Christ loved the church. So authority was actually reframed as self-sacrificing servitude rather than some kind of absolute domestic despotism.
And even earlier in Hebrew texts, the personal autonomy of women entering into contracts is super clear. Take the biblical matriarch Rebekah in Genesis 24. She isn't forced into marriage. Her family explicitly asks for her consent to marry Isaac, and she legally binds the agreement herself by saying, "I will go." What's fascinating is that classic rabbinic sages defend, using mathematical timelines and the legal taxonomy found in Deuteronomy, that she was exactly 14 years old. This would have given her the legal status of a mature na'ara. That means she possessed the full physical and psychological agency to make her own legally binding decisions, instead of just being treated as a child or as property.
All right, moving to Section 4, Classical Islamic Jurisprudence, exploring the systemic restrictions introduced in classical Sharia law.
According to the foundational canonical texts, classical Islamic jurisprudence establishes a very direct gender hierarchy within the household. This verse here, Surah An-Nisa 4:34, grants husbands unilateral domestic authority and it explicitly permits physical discipline. Furthermore, traditional jurisprudence derived from this verse, alongside canonical hadith like Sahih al-Bukhari 5193, actually mandates female sexual availability to the husband, stating that a refusal results in spiritual curses. When it comes to economic autonomy under Sharia, systemic financial dependency is basically institutionalized. The Quranic inheritance distribution laws establish a strict 2-to-1 male-to-female ratio. Now contrast that with the independent property management we saw in ancient Egypt, or the equal pay records of the Persian Arashirara. This structural halving of inherited wealth systematically forces women to rely on male guardians, or a wali, for their economic stability throughout their entire lives.
And in the court system, this mathematical halving actually continues. According to Surah Al-Baqarah 2282, a woman's legal testimony in financial matters is quantified as exactly half that of a man's. So it requires 2 female witnesses to equal 1 male witness. Furthermore, under classical Sharia schools of thought, the diya, which is the blood money paid to a family for a wrongful death or injury, is exactly half the amount for a female victim as it would be for a male victim.
Politically speaking, the ancient tradition of female sovereignty, like what we saw with figures like Hatshepsut or Kubaba, was explicitly dismantled. Responding directly to the news that the Persians had crowned Empress Bahran, who we talked about earlier, the Prophet Muhammad issued a decree recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari 4425. It explicitly banned women from holding political office or leading a nation. This represented a hard stop to a deeply rooted regional tradition of female monarchs.
Canonical hadiths also record direct theological demotions regarding female capabilities. In Sahih al-Bukhari 304, the Prophet Muhammad is recorded telling a group of women that they are inherently deficient in intelligence and religion. And when explaining why, the text specifically points back to that halved value of female legal witness as proof of the intellectual deficiency. For the religious deficiency, it cites their inability to pray during menstruation.
Finally, Section 5, Comparing Systemic Legal Rights, where we'll visualize the shift in these historical patriarchal frameworks.
This matrix right here really helps visualize the core shifts in autonomy. As you can see, pre-Islamic and Judeo-Christian eras offered pretty robust systemic legal parities. Egyptian women could initiate divorce without losing their property. Early Christianity protected women by banning unilateral divorce altogether. Classical Sharia, on the other hand, instituted talaq, giving men instant unilateral divorce power. Ancient Persia mandated equal pay, and female heads of state were absolutely celebrated in antiquity, only to be explicitly banned under the later Islamic framework.
When we think back to those careful, bureaucratic records of the Persepolis tablets, the ones meticulously logging extra rations for postpartum mothers, we start to realize that history just isn't a simple upward curve. Scholars point out that the shift to patriarchal monotheism in the region during the 7th century systematically dismantled thousands of years of deep-rooted legal parities. These were independent rights that women had enjoyed for a very long time.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to ponder as we close out this explainer. If thousands of years of gender parity, equal pay, and political sovereignty can just be unraveled and systematically restricted in such a short amount of time, well, we really have to ask ourselves, what other historical myths are we just taking for granted? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating nonlinear history of human rights. Keep questioning everything and keep learning.